So, first of all, I'm sure that all of you, like me, are incredibly moved and feeling very privileged to have listened to Ruth. Your courage is unbelievable, Ruth. And it's very hard to move from that to anything, but I'll do my best. So, oh, it's not moving. Alex, where is he? Oh boy. Paul, the slideshow is not moving. I don't know what happened. Oh, okay, moving. Okay. So, as you, by the way, all your questions, please put them on paper and hand them over to Toby over there, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the Q&A. As you can imagine, having listened to Ruth, experiences such as hers color the rest of one's life and certainly color the way that one experiences the difficult phase of aging and what comes with it. And Heikkinen from the World Health Organization in Geneva said it very beautifully. I had the pleasure of having been there and listened to it when he put it this way: the way in which we grow old and experience this process, our health and functional ability, all depend not only on our genetic makeup, but also on what we have done during our lives. What sort of thing we have encountered in the course of our lifetime, on how and where we have lived our lives. So when people are exposed to traumatic events, we actually have come to realize over the last few decades it was not something that we assumed, or that the professions of mental health, psychiatry, psychology, and the rest of them acknowledged until 1980 with the introduction of PTSD into DSM. The professions did not know that being exposed to terrible things such as what Ruth talked about has a lasting impact on people, even people that were not young children in their formative years, as it was told. And if we had had time, I would have had a chance to read to you some letters by very esteemed academic psychiatrists, German psychiatrists after the war, who had to evaluate the damage, the psychiatric damage, the physical damage to survivors after the war, and their opinions about how it can't be that those experiences led to such psychiatric symptoms as they were seeing. So one of the reasons why it is so incredibly important that you're here is because what we believe as mental health professionals, as physicians, what we believe to be the way things are, influences tremendously what we actually allow us to see in the patients and recognize in the patients. So over those few last decades, it has become finally clear that when people experience shocking, terrible events, it does lead to significant and long-lasting physical and psychological damage. Now, there is a great variability in the way that individuals respond to it. And what we know is that for the most part, within the first year after exposure to even one single very serious event, such as a car accident or any terrible thing like that, between 10% and 40% of the individuals that would be exposed to it will have what we call post-traumatic responses. About a third of us will recover spontaneously, and about a third of us will go on to have lifelong symptoms that will be at various degrees of severity. Now, what studies show us now beyond doubt is that if we are exposed within our own lifetime to more than 4 serious events that qualify as traumatic events, there is a significant, much greater dysfunctionality and impairment that is to be expected. This is why people like Ruth and people like my own parents and many survivors that you will meet are truly a miracle in and of themselves, because they were exposed to many more than horrific 4 traumatic events a day for a very long period of time, and they still managed to function so productively and remain so constructive. So what is trauma? How do we understand trauma now? Now we understand trauma as the 3 E's, if you like. It's an event that, or a set of circumstances, because it doesn't have to be a one-time event. It can be an ongoing set of circumstances, such as the Holocaust, such as certain people living in certain very terrible environments today. It's an event or a series of circumstances that is experienced by the person as threatening or harmful. That's the second E. So some people will be in the same situation and they will experience it as less harmful and horrific than somebody else. It's very individual, and that is something that they experience as having lasting effects on their well-being. That's the SAMHSA definition today, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. The exposure to trauma in American society today, in the general population, is quite high. Most of us will have been exposed to at least one traumatic event in our lifetime. Around 70% of us will have at least one event like that in our lifetime. That is with regards to experiencing exposure to it. But only about 8 to 10% of us will develop what we consider PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, that lasts for a certain significant length of time. About 8% to 10%, but that is only true about the general population in the United States. Even within the United States, in some areas, in some subpopulations, the percentages are much higher, and in other populations exposed to terror or to political conflict, or areas in which there's ethnic conflict, the percentages are very, very, very much higher, and I'll show you some. I know that all of us know a lot about PTSD, and I will not bore you with a very detailed exposure of the examination of the symptoms, but I do want to mention to you that in the new definition of PTSD, in the new DSM, what is very important to remember is that in addition to intrusive symptoms, right, like flashbacks and smelling and feeling and hearing the things that happen to you, or nightmares, those are flashbacks and intrusive symptoms. In addition to those, in addition to the cluster that used to be called avoidance and numbing, right? The avoidance of being exposed to certain things, not wanting to be reminded of it, not wanting to hear about certain things, and a certain emotional numbing that some survivors show. In addition to that, and in addition to the third cluster, which used to be hyperarousal, right? Startle response and being very quickly sort of triggered into a high affective state when something is emotionally meaningful. In addition to that, the new definition has a very, very important aspect, which is negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So changes in the way we think about the world, in our belief system, changes that are lasting, and they are much more typical for people who have gone through prolonged and massive traumas as opposed to a single event trauma. For example, Ruth, when you say, on that day, in that moment, I buried God, that's a very, very powerful example of really profound negative alterations in cognitions and in belief system and in the feeling of this girl in the world. There was a God, there was a good God, and now there isn't. So that's a good example of that. I just want to remind you that post-traumatic stress disorder, that we all are much more familiar with in speaking about trauma survivors, is only one response, one type of response. There are other post-traumatic responses, primarily depression and anxiety. and we have to be very aware of it, that when we meet people with post-traumatic reactions, they might not have the classic ones of PTSD. Just to sort of quickly show you the percentages in people who are exposed to much more severe events than the events that we are all likely to be exposed to. 60,000 disaster victims speak. That's in a study that looked at many, many studies of disaster-exposed populations, totaling 60,000 subjects. So specific psychological disorders are experienced by 77% of those people exposed to these disasters, and we're talking here about natural disasters primarily, yes? And as you can see, I think, do they have a copy of the slides in their folders, Toby? No? Okay, fine. So just try to look at these and notice how many other reactions appear in people, not just post-traumatic stress disorder. However, when the disorder is caused by intentional malignant intent from one person or one group of people to other people, the traumatic impact of it is much, much more severe than the traumatic impact of a disaster or an accident or something like that. And so in Survivors of the Holocaust, to show you specifically, this graph is very, very telling because it looks at survivors of the Holocaust that did need some mental health intervention. That's why you have two tall pieces there in the middle. One group is the one that did need some mental health intervention, and the other one are those who needed none through their entire life and lived productively and well into old age. This is in 2010, that's 60 years after the end of the Holocaust. And you see that they are just like everybody else in all the other measures of well-being and health, except for PTSD. These two tall pieces show the level of post-traumatic stress disorders in highly functioning individuals, Holocaust survivors, 60 years after the war. These are some rates in veterans, American veterans, also very high, to show you that when people are exposed to interpersonal trauma, it's much, much higher. Why are you likely to meet Holocaust survivors and other trauma survivors as healthcare providers? Because post-traumatic stress reactions, including PTSD, are very strongly associated with a lot of health issues. Health is very much badly, negatively impacted by trauma, and therefore, when people age, they are likely to have a lot more problems. A study that a colleague of mine ran on Israeli prisoners of war. He was one of them, but he's a psychiatrist, and he ran a study. And as he puts it, the effects are of premature aging in many people. A lot of health problems, a lot of decline in functioning. So PTSD is also at a very high risk for dementia and for cognitive impairment. That's another reason why you are likely to find in nursing homes and in all kinds of facilities like that, a higher percent of people who are actually trauma survivors than not, because we don't know what exactly is the nature of the relationship. It's probably bidirectional. Namely, PTSD causes death of brain cells and shrinking of the brain. That's one hypothesis, as seen by the fact that the postmortem brains of people that we know were victims of trauma are smaller than the brains of other people. So either that or that dementia disinhibits the capacity to suppress post-traumatic reactions. In any case, because of dementia and cognitive impairment, these people will end up more likely in our care and in nursing homes and in places that are medical settings, and we will come to meet them. Now, growing old in general involves for all of us a reckoning with the finality of time, with the choices that we made, with the limits on what we can still change about life. And as treaters, especially as mental health providers, but also as physicians, it might be a very difficult experience for us to actually work with someone who has to deal and reckon with the finality of their time, with the fact that they cannot make peace with their path, because they didn't make choices. Choices were made for them to a great extent, and with the fact that we cannot really do much about it. We can't change it, we can't heal, we can't help, and that can make us be a lot less empathetic to survivors at the end of their lives. I will say a little bit more about it in a few minutes to explain these thoughts. PTSD in general, if I focus right now for a minute just on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, PTSD is very underdiagnosed in the population in general. In an Israeli study, you can see, I gave you some examples, very low percent of those that actually have it have been recognized by their general physician as having it. So we have a hard time recognizing it even when we see the patient, and that's something to think about. It's even much more difficult for us to recognize it in elderly patients, and I'll say a couple of things about that as well, but I can already say, why is it much more difficult to recognize in elderly patients? Because PTSD is, first of all, the only mental health condition that establishes as a criterion for its diagnosis an external event that happened, an index trauma. And when people are very old, and I can tell you that from my experience, when older people come to you who are in their 70s or 80s, they themselves often, when they're depressed all of a sudden, or very anxious all of a sudden, they themselves don't establish the connection necessarily to the trauma that happened 65 years ago. Their caretakers or family members certainly often don't establish it. If the person themselves is maybe a little bit cognitively impaired and is now having a hard time, I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine, very intelligent colleague of mine, called me one day and said, I know you're very experienced in caring for survivors of the Holocaust, so tell me what to do. It's really strange, this 80-year-old woman who was a teacher and an artist and very vital, she's all of a sudden very depressed and can't get out of bed, hasn't taken a shower in a month. What is this about? And I said, tell me a little bit more about her. And she said, well, she actually says that she doesn't want to talk about the Holocaust. It's not related to the Holocaust. She actually was relatively lucky. Her father came back and took her. And I said, okay, but what about her mother? Her mother didn't come back, and the first thing that she remembered about her father coming back was that he was very haggard, very broken, and that the farmer who had hid her was fighting with her father to pay him for what he had done for her. So here is, if you like, a screen memory, as we call them. She remembers that, but if that was the attitude of the farmer when the father came back, what was he like in all the time that he was hiding this little girl? So what I wanted to say is the relationship to the index trauma is often lost. The intrusive part of the symptoms is not always there for people after 65 years. For many people it is, and for some people it isn't, so we don't immediately think about trauma. But there is more depression, there's more anxiety, and most important for us to remember is that it's often disguised under a lot of somatic pains and complaints and medical conditions, which are real, which are also sometimes psychogenic, and a lot of medication side effects. So the whole mixture makes it very hard sometimes to understand. And I did have it somewhere later on in the slides, and we'll see that. So we also know that we know very little about PTSD in the elderly, and it's really important for us to pay extra attention when we see people, to ask them about the possibility of traumatic events in their lives. Why do we think that we're likely to see more PTSD in older age? Actually, because there are three reasons why we think it's more likely to surface in old age. First of all, there is a decrease in mental and physical resilience. People sometimes are weaker, they feel more helpless, they feel less capable of doing things, and that sort of allows suppressed memories or memories that were warded off to come much more to the fore. Decrease in financial resources, social resources, new losses, people lose friends, people lose relatives, leaves people really with much less support, and that's very, very much another reason to feel the helplessness and the renewed mourning for previous losses. They have less support, they're more likely to get more depressed and anxious, and the interaction with normative processes of aging. I'm trying to speak, as I always say, as fast as my father used to read the Haggadah, but he had a good pace there. So forgive me. I have until 4, Toby?
Yes.
Okay. So, so we do have to be very aware of the fact that, here we go, that normative processes of aging are likely to actually kick up post-traumatic reactions for people who have had trauma, severe trauma, in earlier times. Why? Because we know that as we age, as we kind of reach a certain point in life, for some of us it's kind of 50, 55 and on, we begin to do more reminiscing, more life review, more meaning making. How did we live? What were our choices? How do we make peace with these choices? All of that kind of stuff. But it's a lot more difficult for trauma survivors to make peace with a life and with choices and with losses that they had so little control over and that were so brutally imposed upon them. It's very different than having to make peace with the fact that, you know, my first marriage didn't work out, I had a divorce, it was very difficult, but then I met my second husband and life was much better. It's not the same as someone who has to say, I lost my family, my parents were brutally murdered, my brother disappeared under brutal conditions, but I ended up in this wonderful country and I met my husband and I had wonderful children. For example, to tell you one of the things that impacts children of survivors is related to that. When you're a child, you realize at some point that had there not been a Holocaust, you wouldn't have been born. Because your parents met in the DP camp or somewhere like that, and they would have never met had there not been a Holocaust. So you're sort of struck in the moment when you understand it, you're struck by this thought of, wait a second, so what? I'm glad that there was a Holocaust because I'm alive? And that shows you, of course, in the mind of a child, but it shows you a very important point about sort of making peace with these events that, yes, maybe led to, maybe good things happened afterwards, but it doesn't make it easier to make peace with what happened then and how horrible it was. So first of all, there is a problem in reaching a certain continuity of sense of self. For example, somebody that I know who was born into a very wealthy German family, German Jewish family. Her father was a banker. She was going to be a doctor. The Holocaust came. Everything was destroyed. She came to this country very damaged, psychologically and physically, married a survivor 25 years older than her, you know, cleaned houses, washed dogs, did whatever she needed to do. There is no sense of simple continuity between the self that she had and the self that she hoped to have become and the self that she actually became. So it's very difficult for a lot of people to establish that continuity that we need in order to get to what Erickson considered the task of old age, which is a sense of integrity, which if we cannot get a sense of integrity in old age, we are risking falling into despair. So for survivors, the chance of falling into despair is high. They don't have that easy continuity. They also don't have the capacity They have much harder circumstances under which to establish a sense of coherence of themselves. Coherence meaning between different parts, because in order to survive, in order to adapt, they had to put aside tremendous pieces of themselves. Ruth was told specifically, do not talk. Many of them were told specifically, don't think about it, forget it, don't talk about it. They themselves had to push it aside in order to get up in the morning and behave in the world with people around them as if they don't know what people are capable of, as if they don't know how bad things can be, and to sort of rejoin the world as if everything is normal. They also had to push a lot aside. So accepting one's unique path in life is much more difficult for people with these types of terribly traumatic histories. And of course, the new losses that inevitably accompany old age awaken a lot of unresolved mourning, a lot of fear and longing and loneliness from previous times. And that's why older adults are much more at risk for depression, anxiety, and PTSD if they were survivors, and any kind of trauma of those that I mentioned there will make an older person a more likely victim of a post-traumatic disorder at older age. I said that recognition of PTSD in older age is much more complicated, and I mentioned why: the relationship to the trauma, the lack of dissociative phenomena, often the fact that it's disguised by the somatic and medical things, and because it's very, very much comorbid. It occurs together often with depression and anxiety, and sometimes we will even, first of all, depression and anxiety in older age are often very underdiagnosed, or when they're diagnosed, physicians and mental health professionals sometimes think, well, what can you do? It makes sense. The person is 90 or 87, they lost their spouse, their kids live in Colorado, their friends all died. Of course they're depressed and there's nothing to be done. What can we do? The fact of the matter is to be stressed to you that depression and anxiety in older age are not normal, no matter what happens in the life of the person, and can be treated. Very important for me to mention. I do want to also mention to you and highlight that there are very, very good brief instruments for assessing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety in older adults. And whenever you think that there might be a possibility that this older adult suffers from either anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder, I highly recommend that you will ask specifically about changes in mood, changes in activities, not just the somatic complaints that they come with, and try to assess them with one of those symptoms tools, because then we can help them better. So here are some brief instruments, and by the way, whoever wants any more detailed information from me after this can put their email here and tell me, and I will provide more information specifically to you. I also want to mention that sub-threshold post-traumatic stress disorder, namely, even if you assess the person, first of all, if it's an elderly person, keep in mind that you have to use a much lower cutoff point than the formal cutoff point for the instrument in younger people. And also keep in mind that the stress that can be caused to older people with sub-threshold, namely symptoms that don't quite reach the formal diagnosis, the distress and the impairment can still be very significant. This is what we see in studies that show us that people with sub-threshold levels of symptoms are very, very much distressed. As for specifically PTSD at the end of life, please keep in mind, we don't really have a lot of research about it. What we do have suggests that at least a quarter, if not more, of people at the end of life develop PTSD, and that we need to use very different strategies of pharmacotherapy with them that take into account the fact that these people are about to die. And that does not often happen, and it often interacts with the treating physician's fear of making the person die, which is really, really a terrible thing, because if you don't medicate pain well enough at that point, you are really exacerbating the PTSD and really not treating that person in the way that they need to be treated at that point in life. I want to get to the issue of dehumanization in medicine, which, as you can see, I quote here a very powerful statement by two physicians. Dehumanization is endemic in medical practice. It is. I've worked in hospitals for many years, and I've seen it firsthand. It is truly endemic in medical practice, and it does not result from bad intentions or lack of good intentions. I will try to explain what I think it results from, which is an interaction between the way that our brain has evolved as a species and some features of modern medicine and medical settings as they are today. So some of the causes for dehumanization in medicine today are functional, and it's hard to kind of work around them, and some of them are non-functional, and perhaps we can modify them or minimize them if we are very aware of them. So first of all, excuse me just 1 second. So first of all, what is dehumanization? So the essence of dehumanization is any time when we somehow find ourselves denying the essence of what is to be human, what is to have a human mind to another person. That's really the essence. So as soon as we look at somebody and we think their mind is not exactly fully functional, we are at a risk of dehumanizing them. The central feature is a diminished attribution, a diminished consideration of other people's mental state and mental workings. This is very, very important because there is a very strong and immediate relationship between dehumanization and empathy. As soon as we dehumanize somebody and see them as not quite human, we have a justification to treat them much worse than we maybe would have if we saw them as equally as human as us, which is exactly what happened with the Nazis, right? They looked at people that looked like people, but somehow in their own mind, they dehumanized them and perceived them as less human than they. And that's why somebody who wouldn't do these things to another German could feel okay doing it to another person that looked like a person but was less of a person for some reason in their own minds. So let's go back to some of the functional and the non-functional causes of dehumanization in modern medicine. The functional ones are the fact that procedures have become very mechanized so that there is much less contact between the physician and the patient. Remember examples that are pretty horrifying by now, but I remember reading about the fact that the village doctor in the little villages a long time ago, if they needed to diagnose if a patient had diabetes, they actually tasted their urine, right? Horrifying as it may be, think about how personal and immediate the connection between a physician and patient was. Now, it's not only the gloves and the masks and the goggles and the whatnot, it's the fact that most procedures, or many procedures, are done totally, by a machine, completely away from the patient. Yes, so that's one cause. Another one is empathy reduction and moral disengagement, two different ones. Empathy reduction to a necessary degree is what people have to do when their job is such that day in and day out they have to deal with people who are in great pain. They have to even cause them some pain in order to treat them, right? We have to stick needles, you have to do all kinds of things. It hurts. You can't be too queasy and too empathetic in that way, or you won't be able to do your job well. And some patients are going to die, especially in palliative care, and all of those demands of and you have to give bad news to people. All of those things require that if you are going to function well, you have to reduce your empathy a little bit, right? Every mother has to do that too, a little bit, right? You have to make your child, take the tetanus shot after they stepped on a nail. You have to hold them when they're trying not to. You have to do a lot of things, right? It's kind of similar. Moral disengagement is because we work now in such large teams, such large medical treatment teams, that no personal single individual, where is it? I do. Oh, sorry. Okay, here it is. Facing up. Okay, let's do this. Let's try to do this. So, when it was one doctor, one patient, it's a different level of moral commitment between the two than when it's a huge team and the team changes all the time. There's a very different sense of moral disengagement. So these are things that are hard to change because that's the way modern medicine operates now. We just have to be aware of it, and if we're aware of it, then maybe we can still find little ways to modify it and minimize it. But some causes are non-functional, such as various de-individuating practices. For example, it used to be the white coat. Now it's not white coat. Everybody in the treatment team gets to choose a little bit their clothing. It's not so, but still, the fact that all medical providers wear a uniform, patients wear a uniform, individual characteristics are sort of erased. Some of it is functional, some of it is not functional. Again, if we're aware of the impact of it, then we don't treat it as just a pragmatic necessity, and we can actually be careful about how much individual characteristics we can maintain. And that is particularly important in long-term care, much more than on acute treatment units. Impaired patient agency is a very, very important thing for us to remember. That I said, the main cause of dehumanization of other people, or perceiving somebody else in a way that will dehumanize that person in my eyes, is when I don't attribute to them a mind that is as functional as mine. Now, patients, by the nature of the fact that they're patients, are often impaired, either because of the illness or the fever or the whatever. Certainly, if they're cognitively impaired on a more long-term basis because of cognitive deterioration, then they're very much at risk to be dehumanized by us. And an important source of dehumanization is the similarity. So SpongeBob, the SpongeBob thing, the yellow square sponge that has been made into a character in children's movies. And why do we perceive that SpongeBob as a person in a sense? Because it has face, and it has features that are like a human, right? We make it have hands and face and legs, and especially because it has a personality and mental processes and feelings that we can identify with as a human. Now, you take a sponge and you make it a human by giving it humanoid characteristics. Dehumanization is the opposite. You take a person and you look at a person who is who is not so similar to the, so to speak, humanoid prototype. So what does it mean if somebody is all of a sudden, you know, old and crinkled and has no hair where we have hair, but does have maybe hair where we don't really want to have hair, and moles and all kinds of other unattractive features that age and illness can cause, and all kinds of things like that that make the person, you know, look like, hey, look at Yoda, for example, right? That's somebody who's kind of human, but not so similar to the humanoid prototype anymore. And that can become very off-putting. That can become very, oh, that's not quite human. Now let's be honest, especially those of us who work with people who are severely ill, or those of us who work with people who are dying because of severe illness, or because those of us who are working with those who are very old. We meet a lot of patients who are not quite like the attractive humanoid prototype. That can be another reason. And another source of dissimilarity is simply ethnic dissimilarity. We live now in a very varied culture, and we can meet a patient who is very dissimilar from us. And that, as I will expand upon in a minute, is another great source of danger for dehumanizing the other, because they just look so different from our clan or from our family. So I'll skip that, and I will again stress that we're talking here about an emotional prejudice that our brain creates. You will forgive me if I sort of meander a little bit between my slides and not go exactly in order. But I will go back to saying the brain, our brain, the way it evolved, responded to the need to be safe in the physical environment first of all. We are small and toothless relative to the big predators, and we don't have claws, and we are slow, we can't run as fast as they, and relative to our physical environment, our brain had to develop in such a way that it will immediately be able to detect danger, because our best way of surviving is not by attacking, but by running away. So we have to detect danger very fast. However, our brain also developed in such a way as to detect social danger very fast, because we lived in isolated clans and tribes, and we had to be able to see very quickly if somebody is likely to be a friend or a foe. Are they likely to attack us, or are they likely to help us? And we had to do it very quickly. Yes? So our brain, the way we evolved over a very, very long period of time, our brain does it automatically, very quickly, on the basis of how similar the other person looks to us. But that doesn't work so well anymore in our current environment, where look at the room, look at your patients, there's like all kinds of shapes and colors, and our brain gets confused, and because of these issues, these dissimilarities, our brain tends to maybe dehumanize certain others who are different from us. And that is not at all related to how consciously egalitarian, democratic, and well-intentioned we are. In fact, if we really are democratic and egalitarian, and we really do want to provide people the best care, regardless of who they are, then what we have to do is recognize our brain's natural tendency to do that and find ways to counter it. When we say to ourselves, no, I don't do it because I really believe in everybody being equal, that's actually when we're most at risk to do it. So in groups and out groups, I just explained to you that we have robust research evidence that shows that when we compare people that look like us in group to people that we perceive as out group, We have an innate, automatic tendency to categorize those who are like us as more human, and those that are less like us as less human. So we have to be very aware of that. It's a form of emotional prejudice, non-conscious emotional prejudice, but we still nonetheless have to be very aware of it so that we can do something about it. We essentially, as I said, to sum up that point, when people look less like us, when they look less like the humanoid prototype, when they look less like our clan people, and they look less like they have a functional mind, we tend to attribute less humanity to them. All of those things, that we consider as essential features of humanity, emotion, intelligence, communication, positive social behavior, all of these things are things that are likely to be compromised by illness. So all of these things elevate the risk for dehumanizing patients. So again, just to quickly mention, a lot of what we learn now from the new field of neuroscience is pertinent to clinical care, because neuroscience allows us to look at what happens in the brain without any intrusive electrodes or whatever. We can just I can ask you to think about your mother-in-law, and I can see what happens in your brain as opposed to when I ask you to think about your child, right? So maybe different things happen in your brain when you think about this or that, and I can record it. And that's how we see that social cognitions, namely thinking about people in general, occurs primarily in a particular part of the brain, and thinking about objects occurs actually in a different part of the brain. And what we see is very, very important, and that is that if I show you pictures or ask you to think about people with features that lead to dehumanization, namely people whose mind is clearly not functioning well, they don't look like the humanoid prototype, they don't look like your clan members, and all of those things that I mentioned, they actually move to be processed in the part of the brain that processes also non-human objects. So really, the brain actually does it in a different place. The good thing about it is that we have certain tricks that we can play, which I'll tell you about, with our own self to regulate our reaction. We can move the processing of that person back to the medial prefrontal cortex, where only humans are processed. We can do that, but for that we need to be very sensitive to the feelings that we sense in us when somebody is actually creating what I called neuro disgust. So neuro disgust is the neural reaction. It's the way that our brain responds to people who evoke feelings of disgust in us, which is why in the Nazi propaganda, Jews were described in very, very disgusting ways. Dirty, smelly, vermin, doing terrible things that are very non-human and show non-positive, like, all kinds of sexual stuff, all kinds of terrible stuff. That's in order to evoke in the perceiver the response of disgust. When somebody evokes in us the response of disgust for whatever reason, they move in our brain to the area that processes not quite human objects. And think about it honestly, how many of us in the encounter with very sick people, very old people, people who maybe don't smell so good, don't look so good, how many of us will have the natural response of disgust? And we have to be aware of it. We have to not push it aside. We have to register it and then do what we need to do specifically in order to move it back to the area that deals with humans and does not dehumanize. So, oops, not going back, not going. not going to the right. I'm stuck. Okay. Okay, we have another little bit. So we would like to think that dehumanization is a rare phenomenon that's limited to things like the Holocaust and all kinds of terrible things. Unfortunately, it actually is not. As I said, it's endemic in medicine, and it's a common phenomenon that's not at all restricted to extreme situations. We would also like to believe that we, of course, are great, good people, and we are invested in helping people, and we certainly would not do that, and that the others, like the Nazis, and even like the Nazi doctors who engaged in tremendously dehumanizing practices, that they were very different from us, but actually they were not. Many of them were highly educated professionals, not at all very different from the public that's sitting right here in the room. So for an example that is very chilling, of course, to remind us all of that, is the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which really was discontinued very, very late. I believe it was finally discontinued in '72. And if you want, I don't think I have the time right now, but I would strongly recommend that you listen to President Clinton's apology to the last remaining 8 survivors of that experiment. And think about it. That experiment was conducted by the US Department of Health, by physicians and nurses, and people highly invested in caring for people just like us. Again, one of the reasons that this is so important for us to understand how our brain evolved is that we evolved really, the brain evolved as a social organ. Our brain evolved to have a great capacity to sense what our group needs from us, what our group wants from us. You know, we depended on life in a group. None of us can survive alone. We are group animals, and we need our group to survive. And therefore, we developed a great sensitivity and a great vulnerability to what other people in our group think of us, what the norms us, what the hierarchy in the group requires from us. Think about that. How vulnerable it makes us to social pressure and to social norms within our own group. So if you want to look at some of the seminal, most important findings from social psychology, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. I'll just briefly run through it. So social conformity, the experiment by Ash, he asked people to tell which is longer, this stick or that stick. A very simple task, right? Very concrete. He had people sit around a round table, 10 people. 9 of them were collaborators of the researcher who said what the research told them to say, and the 10th one was a subject. And 9 people, one after the other, said that the longer stick was actually shorter. You know what happened? By the time it got to the actual subject, many of the subjects actually said, they're right. The long stick is the short stick. In a newer version, using neuroscience, looking at the brain, we also found even worse things. We found that not only did people conform to the opinion of the group, they actually saw it differently. By the time they heard 9 people say so, something changed in their perception of the sticks. This is how sensitive our brain is to conformity within the group. Compliance with authority. How many of you remember the experiment by Milgram? He had somebody sit in the room, and a researcher with a white coat, with authority, told this person to increase the electrical current that was given to somebody in the other room. The person in the other room was a collaborator with the researcher who kept increasing their sounds of distress. And despite the fact that they began to express a lot of distress vocally, most of the people, under the instruction of the authority with the white coat, kept increasing the electrical current. This is how susceptible we are to hierarchy and authority. Finally, the Zimbardo Experiment in California divided a group of students into prisoners and guards. This experiment was supposed to, in a simulated prison situation in the basement of the Department of Psychology. The experiment was planned to take place much longer, but had to be discontinued within, I believe, 4 days, because the prisoners became so depressed and the guards became so sadistic. This is how susceptible we are to role, norms, and expectations. So think about it. Conformity, compliance with authority, role, norms, and expectations, these are all incredibly prominent features of medical settings. So if the doctor says such and such, we might actually do that. So this is why it's so relevant to the situation in medical settings where power imbalances between the patient and the medical treaters are so disrupted, almost like in the Zimbardo experiment, and there is such a diffusion of responsibility and such a degree of authority and compliance with role expectations for the behavior of treaters. Let me show you, if I may, a small example from Scrubs about dehumanization in medicine. Sorry, just 1 second. Sorry.
Screen, put it full screen, okay.
Moving on to our next patient, Mr. Frank Cohn has been in a coma for well over a year. His organs are starting to fail, and he probably won't be with us very much longer. The most important thing to remember during his final hours here on Earth is do not ever come to me and ask me questions about how to treat him. He's a potato. If you do, my answer will always be the same. Sour cream chives, and if I haven't had any protein that day, maybe just a sprinkling of some of those bacon bits. Oh my God. His hand, it moved. Kidding? A man's a potato.
Okay, that's a pretty good example of what I mean. And if you really want a real example of it, you can look at those things on YouTube. There are a couple of patients. One, by chance, had his cell phone on, the microphone on during his surgery, and he recorded, he didn't mean to, but it recorded what the team was saying during surgery about him. The other one actually hid a little microphone in her hair, and it recorded what the team was saying. In one of these cases, the physician was fined $500,000 for the disrespectful way that the medical team was speaking about the patient when the patient was unconscious. Why are we talking about this in conjunction with survivors of the Holocaust? Is because trauma victims in general are at a much higher risk even than other elderly patients or other patients for distancing and dehumanization by their care providers. Why? Because first of all, when we encounter horror stories, such as some of the stories that survivors tell us, it confronts us with such degree of human sadism and such horrific stories and horrific images that the disgust comes up in us, and the disgust is misplaced on the person that told us about it rather than on the people who did it to them. This is the immediate stimulus, if you like, that caused it in us, and the disgust becomes displaced or misplaced on the victim. We might feel also a great sense of need to distance ourselves from this person. We don't want to hear it. We don't know how to deal with our reactions to them. And in some ways, sometimes it's almost, and sometimes not almost, blaming the victim for what happened to them. Maybe, and sometimes it's really quite in the open. You know, if the Jews weren't so, I don't know what, then the local population wouldn't have been so mean to them or so hateful to them, or maybe, you know, things like that. So both disgust and sometimes overly paternalistic attitudes towards the patient are a way of distancing. So as soon as you find yourself sort of compelled to treat somebody with sorry, I don't mean to make you jump, but something like, oh, hi Daisy, how are you today? And kind of barely actually looking at the person as a person, that is the kind of paternalistic behavior that actually is very distancing. You're actually trying to not be with that person. Sorry. Okay, so those are some of the reasons. Another source of reason, which Toby quickly mentioned before, is that trauma survivor patients can actually be very difficult patients. They may exhibit very difficult behaviors that are associated with PTSD, and their behaviors can actually alienate us. They can be belligerent, they can be aggressive, they can be very fearful of us if they're cognitively impaired. A lot of fear can come up. Sometimes even people who are not at all cognitively impaired, but after anesthesia, my own father, when he had surgery, after anesthesia, the next morning he was completely out of it, and he told me that the Nazis were there in the night and that they were beating him, and my friend, whose father is a very respected Holocaust researcher, also Holocaust survivor, went through surgery. She called me. I said, how's your dad? She said, oh, the Nazis are there, but oftentimes it goes away after a few days, but for people with more constant cognitive impairment, it can become a constant source of torture. And if they behave this way, and if they respond to us this way, of course, we're not going to like it. It's going to be very difficult to treat such a patient. So again, a very, very brief scene from Born on the 4th of July. This guy comes back from Vietnam. He's very wounded. He's very post-traumatic.
Help me, huh? What's the matter with you? I don't feel right. I don't feel right either. I need to see the doctor. I need to see him now. I want to see him now. He's always too busy, isn't he? What's deep in now, Kobe? Fucking shit! What's deep in? What do I have to do? You got to put your hands on me. I'm saying, I just want to be treated like a human being. Shit. Trying to keep me fucking trust so I know what's going on around here, man. This is a fucking slum. What's going on, man? Fine. We take that lady yours, we get you out of here in 2 weeks. What?
Okay, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but you get the idea. This is not at all atypical for someone with PTSD. His PTSD is quite fresh at that point. It's just a few weeks, months after his injury. However, in this one here, I will show you, I will just have you listen to a few seconds of an interaction between a Holocaust survivor and her daughter. Her daughter taped it. I actually covered the image. You just hear the sounds. But I want you to understand that that woman, this woman that I'm showing you, she is at other times an elegant, reasonable person. She is definitely, as I said in the very beginning, there's a great variability in the individual response to trauma. And therefore, there is like a big Gauss, distribution. There are people who are very, very damaged, and there are people who remain unbelievably well-regulated, pro-social, capable of containing their very difficult reactions. This lady is one of the people who are more damaged, granted, but nonetheless, this is the woman who came, as I told you, to the United States at the age 17, the daughter of the very wealthy family, who then had a very, very difficult life here and did not meet the right person. And then her husband died, and she had to care for him for many years during a very difficult illness, did all kinds of difficult things, difficult life, very damaged woman. Nonetheless, productive, worked hard, rebuilt her life, had a family, took care of her husband, took care of her daughter, created the socio-economic stability for herself, totally productive member of society. And if you met her on a regular day, an elegant, nice-looking, intelligent woman, very bright woman, in fact, super bright. But listen to this when she's triggered by her daughter.
What's the matter with you? You don't have to see them, all right? You're so upset over this. You don't have to see them. It's okay.
Always, you see, I didn't do this. You're doing all the time. I don't want to see you anymore. I disown you. I don't want to know you. Go with your friends and your people.
Mom, please,
I don't
stop this. What do you mean? I've been with you the whole morning. We had a nice morning. I'm trying to help you. Mama, why are you angry at me? I didn't do anything to you.
You just said to me, don't always tell me what to do.
I didn't say it.
Okay, so you get the affect. You get what happens when this woman is triggered and how out of control and how despondent she gets and how terribly hurt and helpless her daughter feels, who tries so hard to make her feel good. In fact, she lives together in the daughter's house. They pulled their resources, and she has a beautiful apartment in her daughter's house, and the daughter really tries to do the best she can, but she can't fight the PTSD. So again, quickly, I just, let me see, 5 minutes. To remind you, especially for people who are exposed to severe trauma as children, we now see very specifically that there is a real impact, a lasting impact on their capacity to control and contain their stress responses, and there are real changes in the brain. So it's not just a character flaw, it's really something that trauma does to people. And therefore, again, to just kind of quickly recap, elderly trauma survivors are at high risk for being dehumanized by their healthcare providers because of all of the things I mentioned. They are victims of atrocities that we might want to deny, we might want to distance ourselves from. They are old and sick, and often the work with them involves disgusting physical aspects, so that evokes disgust in us. They might exhibit very difficult behaviors associated with their post-traumatic responses, and they are at higher risk for dementia, so they're at higher risk for us to perceive them as having less of a mind. Again, one of the risk factors. Quickly to mention about intergenerational transmission, and then a couple of what we can do to make it better. I'll try to say that in less than 5 minutes. So as for the intergenerational transmission, I really like this way that I quoted from a study that was actually done on Cambodian survivors of the Khmer Rouge. And the reason I'm bringing it is to just highlight to you that after we finally, on the basis of Holocaust survivors, we finally recognized what is PTSD and what are the long-term effects of PTSD, we now have identified it in many, many other trauma-exposed populations, and we've identified similar transmission in the families to the children of survivors. So Field put it this way: parents who continue to be psychologically affected by past trauma, such as trauma stemming from genocide, may communicate, even if indirectly, their emotional vulnerability to their children, thereby instill inordinate concern in the children for the parents' welfare. So an inordinate concern in the children for the parents' welfare. Secondary traumatization is really another way of talking about intergenerational transmission, and that has to do, as Figley put it, who coined the term secondary traumatization, simply being a member of a family and caring deeply about its members makes us emotionally vulnerable to the catastrophes which impact them. And there's also, of course, the stress of living with someone who has the symptoms or the responses that are associated with post-traumatic stress, even if it's not at the terrible levels that I just showed you, even people much less dysregulated than that. So what we see, and I will just give you the basic idea that is really important for me that you walk out with in terms of intergenerational transmission. We see an inordinate investment of the children in protecting their parents, and that has been there from the time that they know their name. It is not something that has to do with an informational knowledge about the Holocaust. It is something that is instilled on an affective, emotional level way before children understand about the Holocaust. They understand not to trigger their parents. They understand that their parents went through something terrible. They understand not to upset them, not to worry them, not to do this, not to do that. And as a result, many of the children of survivors have, throughout their lives, put their parents' needs ahead of their own in many, many ways, trying not to trigger the parent into unpleasant states of worry or anxiety or any other negative emotion, and really trying to protect them. And now when you're seeing them as the parent is sick and dying or suffering, when they become very difficult with you because they don't think you do a good enough job or they think that you don't care enough, it's sometimes simply because of their own difficulty with this inevitable situation where they finally cannot protect the parent and they cannot make the parent feel better. And so their desperation and their lifelong investment in it, their lifelong quest to protect their parents is failing. And that is what you're seeing. And if you understand it, then you might be a little bit more tolerant of it and a little bit more compassionate and sort of meet them at that place. Also, there are those children who rebelled against it and who couldn't do that and who went the other way. And then you have very, very difficult sibling relationships. Or you have the sibling who sacrificed themselves, didn't go to college far away, stayed at home, married the right person that the parents wanted, sacrificed a lot of their own wishes to satisfy the parents' needs. And then you have the sibling who went to live in California and did whatever they wanted and didn't want to come home to visit frequently enough, or various variations on that theme. And then there's a lot of issues between the siblings. Or you have siblings who both want to protect the parents very, very much, but have very different ideas about it. One is religious and feels that everything needs to be done to keep the parents alive as long as possible, no matter what. The other one is not religious and loves the parent, and from their perspective, palliative care and not taking extreme measures is actually the right way to love and protect the parent. And you get very intense conflicts and very difficult relationships, really in many ways because of the intensity of the need behind it in the different ways to protect a parent that has been perceived as someone who has suffered so much already before, and each child is trying to do it in their own way. As to the role reverse, here is what I wanted to say. There's been a role reversal, in a sense, with children trying to protect their parents. And if you want, there's a beautiful book called A Thread of Grace by Maria Russell, an Italian writer, about a survivor woman. And at the very end, after you've read the whole story and you've identified so much with this heroine, with the main character, the survivor, you have the epilogue that's written by the hospice rabbi in Toronto, where he describes, you know, this child's response and this child's response to the impending death of their survivor mother. Beautiful book. Another thing, last point about the second generation that you have to understand is sometimes when parents have survived terrible, terrible things and they have to push away a very large part of their emotional life in order to function in the world post-trauma, and in order to defend and protect their children from a lot of the stuff that they have been through. There is in children of survivors, as we see in research, in many, many highly functioning samples of children of survivors, there is a very common theme of what's called failed intersubjectivity. So feelings that emotional communication was not possible. It wasn't, it couldn't be open. One couldn't talk about one's own needs. One couldn't talk about conflicting things because one didn't want to hurt the parent. And that there wasn't really a way for the second generation to learn how to negotiate very different needs, and there wasn't a sense of being really, that in a relationship, when things are difficult, you can talk and you can expect to be fully understood. There is almost, if you like, the opposite belief that there's no way I will really be understood. There's no real openness on the other side. I will never really be understood. As soon as we have different opinions or needs, it will be one side has to sort of roll over the other side and one side has to totally surrender. There's no real intersubjective meeting in the middle. That also is very important in terms of your relationship with your patients and how you speak with them. Lastly, really, last few minutes, how do we do anything about those biases that I spoke about in medical setting? Are they really inevitable? Is there anything we can do about it? So the hopeful and optimistic message that I want to leave you with is that this bias can actually be reversed. And we see it reversed in the brain even. So when we use neuroaffective science to look at it, we can see the processing of the disgusting or dehumanized person move back into the right place. And some of those things that are important in that is, first of all, we have to understand what our own baggage with regards to trauma is. And I won't get more into that, but that is very important. We have to understand what are we doing with our own pain, and that will help us sort of do a little bit of soul searching as to how we deal with other people's pain. Do we distance it? Do we over-identify with it? Are we imposing our opinions and so forth? As for de-individuation, do the opposite, especially when people are not exactly cognitively fully there. Bring as much information about their lives, their role, who they were, what they liked into the room to remind us. I always give the example of a patient who lay in the room with my aunt. She was in a nursing home. She was very demented and a mass of organic matter, if you like. And it really was very disgusting. She was huge, she was disgusting, she was really a very off-putting sight. And then I raised my eyes and I saw this big poster-sized photograph of her husband. Her husband, when he was about 40 years old, in mid-action, kind of smoking a cigarette and clearly talking to somebody, and he was hot. He was really, he was like a character from a 1950s, you know, great movie with one of those, you know, good-looking guys. That is another thing that's very important for us, to include pictures not only of the patient, and preferably of the patient when they were young and at their prime, reminding us that they were like us, that they had a life like us, that they were active, especially pictures of the patient in interaction with somebody else that cares about them and in mid-motion. That really sort of brings it to life. Also, very simple thing and very powerful thing. Just thinking about the other person's mind. Even if the person themselves is out and has no functioning mind anymore, if we ourselves make ourselves think about their mind, it moves the processing of that patient back into the human social cognitions. And it's enough to think, I wonder if she liked broccoli or not. As soon as we think about their mind, they go back to being processed as people. So let's do the best we can to maintain our patients' human dignity and our own. Thank you so much.